Flight 1182. Ground, 6:12 p.m. Dara Kovac had been building Flight 1182's reroute for 11 minutes when dispatch flow pulled it out from under her. A line of severe convective weather was stacking up across the whole central corridor, 6 other dispatchers in the room fielding their own version of the same problem, radios and phone lines overlapping into the specific controlled chaos Dara had learned to move through calmly across 9 years at this console, and Dara's queue had crossed the threshold dispatch flow used to trigger automatic workload rebalancing sometime around minute 9, without her noticing, because she'd been too deep in. The specific problem 1182 presented to be watching a queue counter. The reroute itself wasn't complicated on paper. Divert the planned route 30 miles north around the worst of the cell, land at Fairmont instead of the originally filed alternate, burn maybe 18 extra minutes of fuel doing it. What was complicated, and what existed nowhere yet except in Dara's head, was that Fairmont's crosswind runway had a documented gust handling limitation on the specific aircraft type flying 1182 that morning, a limitation she'd caught from a service bulletin 2 weeks earlier and had been planning to factor into the fuel load as an additional buffer, a manual adjustment she hadn't logged into the system yet because she'd been 3 steps deep into the routing math when dispatch flow reassigned. The flight plan to Marcus at the next console over. She'd read that service bulletin the way she read most of them, carefully, once, weeks before it became relevant to anything specific, filing it away in the particular mental drawer every dispatcher kept for exactly this kind of detail, information too specific and too situational to formally enter into any system until the day it actually mattered. That drawer had never once failed her across 9 years. It had also never once been visible to anything dispatch flow could read. Ground, 6:23 p.m. Marcus picked up her partial work exactly where the system told him it stood, which was considerably further along than where it actually stood, because dispatch flow's transfer logic carried forward every field she'd formally entered and none of the judgment she hadn't gotten to yet. He'd been a dispatcher for 4 years, solid and methodical, the kind of colleague who double-checked his own math out of habit rather than anxiety, and there was nothing in his review of the file that would have told him anything was missing, because a missing field looks identical to a field that was never needed in the first place once it's simply absent from the display in front of you. He finished the routing, calculated fuel against the standard alternate airport requirements, and released the flight plan for Flight 1182 at 6:41, a fuel load that comfortably met every regulatory minimum for a diversion to Fairmont under normal conditions, and that carried no allowance at all for a crosswind limitation that existed only in a service bulletin Dara had read and a mental note she'd never had the chance to write down. Somewhere in the transfer, a small system-generated note had appeared in the file's activity log, reassigned from D. Kovac, workload threshold exceeded, a single administrative line that told Marcus a colleague had been busy, and told him nothing at all about what specifically she'd still been holding in her head when the system pulled the file out from under her. Air, 7:52 p.m. Captain Reyes felt the aircraft skid sideways on approach into Fairmont before the tower's crosswind report had finished updating on his display, a gust considerably stronger than forecast, exactly the kind of handling limitation Dara's service bulletin had flagged 2 weeks earlier for this specific tail number. His first officer called the numbers off the display as they worked the go-around checklist together, the particular practiced rhythm of 2 people who'd flown together long enough to not need most of the conversation they were still having out loud anyway, partly for the recorder and partly because saying it aloud kept both of them honest about exactly what the aircraft was doing versus what they wanted to believe it was doing. Gust at 34, that's above our comfortable margin on this tail number. Going around. Going around, confirmed. He went around. A missed approach burns fuel nobody plans for casually, and a second attempt, 12 minutes later, burned considerably more, the crosswind still gusting above the aircraft's comfortable handling margin, forcing a second go-around that put Flight 1182's remaining fuel meaningfully closer to the regulatory reserve minimum than anyone in that cockpit wanted to be discussing out loud. The cabin behind them stayed mostly calm, a few passengers glancing up at the second bump of turbulence on the missed approach, most of them entirely unaware that the numbers scrolling past on the cockpit's fuel display were quietly becoming the most important thing happening on that airplane. Second go-around, the first officer said, flatter now, the adrenaline of the first one settling into something more clinical. We need dispatch on this before we try a third. Captain Reyes brought the aircraft around into the holding pattern the tower assigned, a wide, patient circle over Fairmont that felt considerably less patient from inside the cockpit than it looked on radar, both pilots running their own mental math in parallel, distance to the second alternate, fuel burn rate at holding altitude, the specific, quiet arithmetic that every commercial pilot trains for and hopes never to actually need outside a simulator. Neither of them said the word emergency out loud yet. Both of them were close enough to it that the word sat unspoken in the cockpit anyway, doing its own kind of work. Ground, 8:04 p.m. Dara was 3 flights deep into an entirely different reroute when she glanced up at the main status board out of habit, the way she did every 20 minutes or so regardless of whose flights were showing, and saw Flight 1182 sitting in a holding pattern over Fairmont with a fuel remaining figure that made her stomach drop before her brain had fully caught up to why. For a full 3 seconds she simply stared at the number, running the same quick mental math every dispatcher in that room could run in their sleep, remaining fuel against distance to the nearest viable alternate against however many more minutes a third approach attempt might cost if it went the same way as the first 2, and the math didn't come back comfortable. She pulled the flight plan Marcus had filed. She saw the fuel load calculated against standard alternate requirements. She saw no crosswind buffer anywhere in the document, and she felt, in the space of maybe 4 seconds, the specific vertigo of recognizing a mistake as her own before she'd even fully confirmed what had happened to cause it. Marcus. 1182, did anyone flag the crosswind limitation on that tail number for Fairmont? He looked up from his own console, already half reaching for the file. What crosswind limitation? She didn't waste time explaining the service bulletin right then, there wasn't time for the full explanation, only for the version that would get a fuel number and a diversion recommendation into a cockpit in the next 90 seconds. She pulled the bulletin up on her own screen with one hand while reaching for the company frequency with the other, running the fuel math against the regional field's distance while the call connected, the particular narrow focus that 9 years at this console had trained into her, everything outside the immediate problem simply falling away until the problem itself was handled. Air, 8:07 p.m. The dispatch relay reached Captain Reyes through the company frequency, Dara's voice considerably steadier than she felt, walking him through the service bulletin's specific gust threshold and confirming, in real time, that the aircraft's current fuel state gave him one more approach attempt at Fairmont before regulatory minimums forced a diversion to their second alternate, a smaller regional field 90 miles east with no comparable crosswind concern but considerably less traffic. Infrastructure to handle an unplanned arrival. She could hear the specific controlled tension in his voice even through the radio's flattening effect, the same tension she recognized from her own side of exactly this kind of call, 2 professionals doing careful, urgent math out loud together because neither of them had the luxury of doing it silently and comparing notes afterward. Copy, dispatch. We'll give Fairmont one more shot with the updated gust numbers you gave us. If we can't get stable, we're going to the regional field, and I want fuel confirmation on that before we commit. Confirmed, you'll land at the regional field with reserves intact if you divert now rather than attempting a third approach at Fairmont. I'd recommend the diversion over a third attempt given where your fuel's sitting. Copy that. Diverting. Ground, 8:19 p.m. Flight 1182 landed at the regional field with fuel reserves inside the regulatory minimum but closer to it than any flight Dara had dispatched in 9 years, a controlled, entirely safe outcome that had nonetheless come considerably closer to an actual fuel emergency than anyone in that control room wanted to sit with once the adrenaline wore off. The confirmation came through as a routine landing report, 3 flat lines of text on her screen, tail number, field, fuel remaining, nothing in the formatting to suggest how close the margin had actually been unless you knew, the way she did, exactly what number should have been sitting in that field if the crosswind buffer had made it into the original plan. She sat at her console for a long moment after the confirmation came through, not moving, running the same 6 minutes back through her head, 6:23, the moment dispatch flow had reassigned a flight plan mid-thought and carried forward everything she'd typed and nothing she hadn't. Marcus rolled his chair over without being asked, glancing at her screen, then at her face. That's on the system, not on you. You caught it in time. I caught it because I happened to look up at the board at exactly the right minute, Marcus. That's not a safety margin, that's luck wearing a uniform. He didn't have a ready answer for that, and she didn't especially want one. She spent the rest of that shift working through her cue with the particular, deliberate calm of someone actively refusing to let her hands shake, and drove home a little after midnight replaying the same 6 minutes on a loop she suspected she'd be replaying for considerably longer than one night. The following morning, Simone Achterberg's office sat 2 floors above the dispatch room, a corner space with better light than anything downstairs, and Dara had been in it exactly 4 times in the 2 years since Simone took over as Meridian Air's Vice President of Dispatch Operations Technology, twice for department meetings and twice, before that, for reasons that had nothing to do with either of their current jobs. I read the incident report, Simone said, not looking up from it right away, still scanning the timeline printout with the specific focus of someone determined to understand a system's failure on its own terms before she let anyone else's framing of it in. Dispatch flow transferred an in-progress flight plan mid-analysis and didn't carry forward an unlogged judgment call. That's what happened. That's what happened. The system did exactly what it was built to do. Rebalance workload during a surge event so no single dispatcher's queue backs up past a safe threshold. I don't see a malfunction in this report, Dara. I see a genuinely difficult edge case. I'm not telling you it malfunctioned, Simone. I'm telling you it took a piece of judgment that existed only in my head and handed a colleague a flight plan that looked complete when it wasn't, because your system has no way to know the difference between a field I haven't filled in yet and a consideration I haven't had time to write down at all. 2 years earlier, for context neither of them needed to say out loud. They'd built the original dispatch software together, back when Meridian Air's whole operation ran on a homegrown system the two of them had cobbled together during their first years married, before the divorce, before Simone moved up into a leadership role that put institutional weight behind exactly the kind of automation Dara had spent 9 years learning to be quietly skeptical of from the console where she actually used it. Dara still remembered those early years with a specific fondness that had survived the marriage's ending better than almost anything else from that period, the two of them at a kitchen table with a laptop between them, arguing over database schema the same way they'd later argue over workload rebalancing thresholds. Except back then every disagreement had ended in bed rather than in a corner office 2 floors above where either of them actually worked. Neither of them had planned for the marriage to end somewhere in the gap between those 2 roles. It had, quietly and without much drama as these things went, both of them agreeing, in the end, that they'd become better colleagues than spouses somewhere along the way without either of them fully noticing the shift happening in real time. They'd built a genuinely functional co-parenting arrangement in the years since, 2 kids who split their weeks evenly enough that neither household ever felt like the other one, and this was, as far as either of them could remember, the first time since the divorce that a professional disagreement between them had actually mattered enough to put real weight behind it, rather than the ordinary friction of 2 people who happened to still work at the same company and occasionally disagreed about database architecture over a shared custody calendar. Back in the office. I want a hard rule, Dara said. Dispatch flow doesn't reassign a flight plan mid-analysis without an explicit handoff confirmation from the original dispatcher, full stop, even if it means a queue backs up past your threshold for a few extra minutes during a surge event. That defeats half the point of automatic rebalancing, Dara. The whole value is that it doesn't wait for a busy dispatcher to notice she needs help. The whole value doesn't matter if the handoff it performs automatically is incomplete in a way that nearly put a fuel-critical decision in front of a crew with 12 fewer minutes of buffer than they should have had. I had 11 minutes into that reroute. I hadn't logged the crosswind buffer yet because I hadn't finished thinking it through in a form the system could capture. That's not a workflow gap, Simone. That's the entire category of thing a system built around logged fields is never going to see. Simone set the report down flat on the desk between them, the specific gesture of someone deciding to actually engage with an argument rather than simply wait it out. Walk me through what a confirmation step would actually look like operationally. I'm not saying no, I'm saying I need to understand what it costs before I take it upstairs. A single prompt. Before any transfer executes, the original dispatcher gets 10 seconds to hit confirm or hold. If she's mid-call, mid-crisis, genuinely unable to respond, it can still time out and transfer automatically after those 10 seconds, same as now. But if she's sitting right there and simply hasn't had the chance to log something, those 10 seconds are the difference between Marcus getting a complete picture and Marcus getting a picture that only looks complete. 10 seconds during a surge event, multiplied across however many transfers happen on a bad night. 10 seconds is nothing next to 2 go-arounds and a diversion with reserves inside minimums, Simone. I need you to actually sit with that comparison instead of the abstract cost of friction. Simone was quiet for a moment, still holding the incident report, and Dara watched her read back through it a second time with the specific attention of someone who'd stopped defending the system and started actually looking at what it had done. A mandatory handoff confirmation, Simone said finally. Built to interrupt the rebalancing trigger, not remove it. I can take that to engineering. That's what I'm asking for. I still think you're right that I wasn't seeing the specific gap, for what it's worth. I built this system to stop dispatchers from drowning during exactly the kind of night you had last night. I didn't build it to ask whether the thing it was handing off was actually finished. 3 weeks later. Dispatch flow's rebalancing logic now paused at any workload threshold trigger and required the original dispatcher to explicitly confirm handoff readiness before a flight plan transferred, a change that added, on average, 40 seconds of friction to a process built specifically to minimize friction, a trade-off Simone signed off on in the engineering review without argument. The rollout itself took longer than the design decision had, 3 weeks of testing against simulated surge scenarios before engineering felt comfortable pushing it live across the full dispatch floor, and Dara sat in on 2 of those test sessions herself, watching the new confirmation prompt fire in real time against a recreated version of the exact surge conditions from the night of Flight 1182, checking, more than once, that the 10-second window actually behaved the way she described it. In that office rather than the way it might have quietly drifted into something less protective by the time engineering finished building it. Dara still watches the status board every 20 minutes out of a habit that predates dispatch flow by 9 years and will probably outlast whatever replaces it. Marcus checks in with her before releasing any reroute that started on someone else's console now, unprompted, a habit he picked up the week after Flight 1182 and has never once mentioned needing to, though she's noticed he started keeping his own version of her mental drawer too, a small notebook beside his keyboard where he jots down exactly the kind of situational detail no system field was ever built to hold. She and Simone still co-parent on the same schedule they've kept for 3 years, still trade the kids on Sunday evenings in the same parking lot they've traded them in for 3 years, the same brief, practiced handoff of backpacks and a quick rundown of the week ahead, and neither of them has said much more about Flight 1182 since that morning in the corner office, beyond Simone mentioning once, weeks later, picking up their daughter, that the handoff confirmation logic had caught 2 more incomplete transfers in its first 3 weeks running, small things, nothing close to another Fairmont, but real enough to count. Good, Dara said, loading her daughter's backpack into the car. Yeah, Simone said, and that was the whole conversation, the kind of exchange that had become, somewhere in the last 3 years, entirely ordinary between them, 2 people who'd once built something together, then stopped being married, then kept building things together anyway, in whatever shape that turned out to actually take, a partnership that had survived a divorce and, so far, everything that had come after it, including 6 minutes over Fairmont that neither of them was ever quite going to fully stop thinking about.